Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anthony Chuli, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Matthew Vernhout, and we're going to be talking about GDPR. We are 1 year plus into GDPR, and I think it's an awesome opportunity for us to talk about this piece of legislation 1 year later and some of the findings, some of the fines, and what's next for this piece of legislation. So, Matt, just for our audience that may not be familiar with this piece of legislation, what is GDPR?
So GDPR is a piece of legislation that came from the European Union. So it covers all the different member organizations within the union. And it really is a way, it's a modernization, if you will, of privacy legislation, which the European market has a completely different viewpoint on in regards to personal privacy, personal rights for data privacy than much of the rest of the world, if you will. Especially in North America, we tend to be a little more pro-business collecting data and
A little bit more relaxed.
yeah, that's a great way to say it. Yeah. So the legislation has sort of come out. It's level set privacy to a degree in the European Union, which is approximately 550 million people, so not a small chunk of people. But they really set out to standardize their privacy legislation and modernize it and talk about data rights and data access.
So as I mentioned, we're 1 year plus, right? I think it went enforcement in May of last
May 25th.
May, the exact date.
I have a sticker. It says I survived May 25th.
There was a big scare and a lot of anxiety and kind of a rush right before that enforcement date from many brands and senders who maybe, or rightfully so, were a little bit more laxed about getting their ducks in order before this enforcement date. How are things now?
I think a lot of businesses have sort of got through the rush. We saw the same thing happen when CAN-SPAM came out. We saw the same thing happen when Castle came out. We saw the same thing in Canada when PIPEDA came out for our privacy legislation. And, it's businesses that need to then build process, need to educate staff, need to change everything potentially. And with GDPR, it was fairly significant changes. And I think a lot of the marketplace, at least outside of the European Union, sort of was like, oh, it's not going to really impact us. And then 6 months to deadline was like, oh, it's really going to impact us. And everyone rushed, and there was sort of a mad dash. And we saw the same thing, with prior legislation. I think anytime we have big legislation changes like this, these types of things happen. And there was a recent study, you and I were talking about it as we were preparing for this, that 57% of businesses surveyed out of 300 respondents feel confident in their GDPR process. So, that 43% that's left over is not insignificant. And I think to a degree, most businesses have a process, but they maybe aren't 100% confident in where they're at and where they are going.
Let's talk about some of the actual real life examples of fines and enforcement of this, because I think everyone, including myself, was waiting to see how serious this is going to be. And it sounds like there have been some pretty notable fines and examples recently.
Yeah, and I think everyone's always worried like day one someone's going to get a huge fine. And that typically doesn't happen because there's always, research, there's always warning letters, there's always negotiation, there's always, something going on that sort of delays enforcement action. But now that we're a year in, we've had time for all of these things to happen. We've had a number of very significant data breaches happen. Looking at Marriott, the Starwood hotel brand breach, that was reported at a 99 million euro or around 125 million US dollar penalty that was enforced by the European Union data protection agencies. We saw a hospital in the Netherlands that was fined 460,000 euros for not having adequate protection. So it's not even a matter of they were breached. They were deemed to not have adequate protection, at least according to the articles that I was reading. And then, we've seen smaller incidences, still 400,000, big dollar values for other violations in different legislation. So in France, or most recently I read one in Romania. So they're coming across the union now, and I think it's just a matter of we've hit that time where investigations have happened, breaches have been reported, and I think that's where we're going to see most of these violations. There's also been big violations against Google and Facebook and things like that that are still in the process of being dealt with.
Talk a little bit about, in my mind, I think maybe I'm naive, but I feel like a lot of marketers said, oh, we did this GDPR thing, check, next, right? And it's like a task list item, like we're good, we're compliant. Can you share your thoughts about that? This is an ongoing piece of legislation that's evolving. What's coming for GDPR? What's next?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different ways that legislation gets created around the world. There's some countries will write out sort of here's the law and then wait for court decisions and things like that to come out with how does it get enforced, what type of guidance can happen to businesses and guidance that will be given to individuals and things as that progresses. And we've seen a lot of that in Canada. It's a very common model. Whereas in the US, you get more verbose laws that tell you, here's what you do. And it's not so much dealt with in the courts. Like it is, but it's more like a lot of it's enforced by, the FTC under CAN-SPAM, et cetera. So every time we see a new decision come out, it's like getting more guidance or a new decision to help us make more business decisions internally. And that should be used to continuously make sure your program is up to date. The hospital one is a key example of that where, maybe they are GDPR compliant, but they didn't have adequate security standards. Okay, well, let's go back and check. Do we have adequate security standards? What can we change? Are we monitoring them? Do we keep them updated?
And I think, GDPR, in my opinion, was kind of the benchmark that we're starting to see, as you talked about, other pieces of legislation throughout the world, including here in the States and in California specifically, that are using that as kind of the new model, the new benchmark in data privacy and data governance. Do you think that trend will continue where we'll start seeing more restrictive and more pertinent legislation being put in place to protect users' rights?
Yeah, I certainly do. A good example of that is Brazil has their GDPR version coming into force in 2020 as well. So it's basically a copy and paste with some minor changes. Some things were slightly removed, but it's very, very similar to GDPR. We have the CCPA in California, which is going to change a lot of business practices, not just in California, but all over the US because it's such a large population group that everybody does business in California. So it's going to impact a lot of businesses. We've seen legislation come in Nevada and Washington, in other states as well. So all of these things are an effort to keep up. And even back in Canada, we've now seen changes and a desire to update our privacy legislation that we have been pushing for as a community for a while, but at the same time, maybe never pushed as far as GDPR was going to go. But in order to maintain our adequacy within the union, we're going to have to move farther maybe than originally was asked for, if you will, but to get close enough to maintain adequacy.
You shared with me a memorable statement while we were preparing for this about this legislation that has come into enforcement is a result of people's inability to self-regulate, right? So it's almost been a requirement because as a society or culture, especially businesses, our inability to actually self-regulate data privacy. So to close this off, I'd love to know, in your opinion, what do you believe needs to happen to kind of change this culture where data breaches happen so frequently now that people just kind of are numb to it?
It happened again. Right. Yeah. So there's a number of different things. There's a great program, Privacy by Design, that talks about when you're developing your platform, put privacy at part of the actual planning phase. Before you even start coding, you're building privacy into the platform. So things like encrypted columns and data retention policies, data minimization, things to make it that much less useful, if you will, if someone does get in. So you've encrypted the data to a point where nobody can access it. Data minimization, it's something that I've been spending a lot of time writing about. It's something I've spent a lot of time internally pushing in regards to, setting hard enforcement policies for data retention, data deletion, and things like that to make sure that, if there ever is a breach within any organization, you don't lose everything because you just didn't keep everything. If you don't need someone's birth date, don't ask for it.
Right.
Don't keep it. And I think, we see this a bit in CASL, the Canadian privacy or anti-spam legislation. where they've actually built into it and set enforcement for director liability. So the president of a company was just sued or just issued a $100,000 fine for violations of Castle. So I think when you start to reach into the actual, individual's pocket as opposed to the corporate pocket, it gets the attention of other business owners and business management teams to say, oh, we could be held responsible, not just the company. Like, that gets people's attention.
Accountability.
As well. It adds accountability, and that's one of the key principles of privacy set out in the OECD privacy framework originally. Is accountability is one of the largest principles that a lot of people spend time on.
I agree. I think data privacy is such a complex topic that it's not something easily solved, but it's super interesting times, I think, post GDPR, keeping watch of other legislations and kind of maybe a more restrictive shift into data privacy and its accountability. So I wanted to thank you for joining us today, and wanted to thank everyone for tuning in. I encourage everyone to visit our blog and check out some of the articles and guides that Matt's written about regarding Castle and GDPR and some other privacy legislation. Thanks for tuning in.